person. She was actually a mom of one of Ben's new friends from preschool. And she was cutting my hair. So, you never know how that conversation is going to go, whether they're going to be the question askers or you're going to be the question asker. But in this case, I happen to be the question asker. And so I was just trying to get to know her a little bit better. And I was inquiring about her family. And it turned out, and I didn't know this, and I've known her daughter for years now, that her daughter's father had died. And then we were talking, and I found out not only had her daughter's father died, but her daughter's grandfather, her dad, had died early as well. And she said, everything happens for a reason, right? She knew what I did for work, and she was looking for some, I don't know, she wanted me to agree with her. And you could tell that she had sort of built a lot upon that belief, a lot of how she was reconciling what had happened in her world and in her life based on, well, everything happens for a reason, right? Have you ever heard somebody say that? Everything happens for a reason? Maybe you've said it yourself. Well, today we're going to talk about that. We're in a Mythbusters series, and what we want to do is trade these things that might be half-truths for real truths that we can build our lives upon. Because of the nature of our community today, I'd like us to be a little bit of like a shop class where we can interact. And so I would love for you guys, this is not to stretch those of you who hate this, but if you like being interactive, think of this as a classroom today. So my question is, when you hear that, well, everything happens for a reason, right? When are those circumstances when you tend to hear that or you tend to say that? Difficult and uncertain times. Yeah. When something bad happens. Right. Both of those. You want to know why. Exactly. Yeah. When you don't have an answer. Right. Anybody else? Yeah.
Later on, when you're looking back at that process,
you might say it way down the road. Okay. Hang on to that. Don't give it all away, Carol. So what are some other ways of saying the same thing? Everything happens for a reason. This one's a little harder, though. It was God's will. Okay, you could hear that. Yep. Yeah. It was meant to be. Yep, another way of saying it. Yeah, somebody might be saying it so that they have the strength to persevere. Kind of, yeah, that's related, sure. Yeah. God doesn't give you anything. So that's next week. That's next week. You can preach. We'll talk, okay? Right, so it's the will of God. You might hear that. All part of God's plan. You might hear something like that. Or you might hear something like God has a master plan. Now, what are the problems with these sorts of things? What sorts of problems do they create for us? Everything happens for a reason. Yeah, Gail. Right. The reason doesn't make any sense. Yeah. There doesn't seem to be a reason. Yeah. What other problems does this make for us? Yeah. Right. If that's part of God's plan, then I don't want anything to do with God. Yes. Thank you for saying that. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's cruel. If God is a loving God, how come it's sort of mamby-pamby, sort of? Yeah. Yeah. Right. So you guys are all touching on what I think is the biggest danger about a statement like this. I think that while we say it to build our faith, it actually erodes our faith. Everything happens for a reason. This was all part of God's plan. And honestly, I've been thinking about this for at least a week now. And I've been trying to remember the times in my life when I've heard people say this to me. And most often, I have heard this phrase from people who have left the church, actually. They're not attending church anymore, and they are trying to pull their faith along with them. And, you don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg. God did this to me, or, I left for other reasons. But they're trying to bring faith into their life, but they've actually left it behind. And this is, I think, it's circumstantial evidence, but I think I have enough of it that I actually think this statement in particular does erode faith. It just, it's like if you go out west into some of those rock formations like the Badlands, you can see how the wind and the water has eroded the rock over time. That there's actually a real danger to our faith, however slow and however creeping. Now, you can put the problems with this sort of phrase into 3 buckets, and I'm reliant somewhat on Adam Hamilton's book, Half-Truth. So first, we've already said God is the one who wanted terrible things to happen. Okay, so you have to draw that conclusion from it. And the second bucket, the second problem is that it leads us towards this fatalism or indifference. So, you could pray for the next presidential campaign, and well, who wins? Well, it's whatever God's will is, and why do we even pray? You could think about it. Some of you guys are really big sports fans. I'm thinking of where's Tom Devlin when you need him, and he wants us to pray Patriots to win. I know a lot of us do. But, where is God in all of that? Or, you might take the fatalistic approach and maybe you wind up with cancer, but you might say, oh, well, it's God's will. I have cancer. Why should I even treat it, right? So it can kind of go down that road, and that's not a road that speaks of the God that we espouse to believe in. And then, if you take this, well, it's God's will approach, we can actually divorce ourselves from personal responsibility. So, our students and leaders are in some underprivileged neighborhoods this week, and they might say, oh, well, it's God's will, these people don't have what they're supposed to have, then they would never go. We would never be motivated to give because, well, it's God's will. Why would I interfere with that? So it takes away from our personal responsibility. And there's a lot of problems with that. So another example is, let's say I cheat on my husband, which I would never do, mostly because it'd be bad for me. No, and I love him. So if I cheat on my husband, that must have been God's will, right? Because it's something that happened. And then the suffering that I would put my husband through, I would put my children through, would all be part of God's will. Do you see how this sort of just like, if we start saying everything that happens is part of God's will, it gets ugly really fast. Or if we say everything happens for a reason, well, maybe that happened for a reason because I was being a very selfish individual, but that's something different. That's just simple cause and effect. If we do something here, it affects all these things. That's true. Okay. So this begs the question of how involved is God in our lives anyway? And there's 2 extremes, and there's a bazillion spots in between. So one extreme is God caused you to choose the socks that you wore this morning. Okay? I actually had a friend in college who believed that. She was diagnosed with OCD. So there's an extreme. Like, God is controlling even the most minute of details. And then there's something that's called deism. And that's that God created it all and left it. God created us all and left it. Has nothing to do with us, with the world. And then there's what sort of the Orthodox Christian church, so not just mainline, but most Christians believe, is that God does intersect in our lives, okay? And that God can influence the things that happen to us, our own behavior, and that we also, through prayer, and possibly through our actions, because sometimes our actions can be a prayer, can influence God. So, lest we devalue prayer, let that be a reminder that prayer, according to Scripture, can sometimes influence God. Okay? So God is involved in our lives. But the Scriptures do not say that God causes every single thing to happen. Now here's one of the passages, I think the main passage, that gets misconstrued into this idea that everything happens for a reason. Christy read it for us, but I'm going to read it again. Now, I want you to listen for this idea, everything happens for a reason, and I want to see if you can find it in the Scripture, okay? In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. So this is Paul, and he's talking to Christians. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans, and he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. So the Spirit is involved in prayer, okay? And then verse 28, this is where this sort of half-truth comes from. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, I'm going to, if you could leave this verse up, guys, I'm going to ask you a few questions about it. In this verse, does it say, God makes everyone's life good? No. Does it say, God will keep you from harm? Does it say, you will not suffer if you seek him? What does it say? Really? Right. God will work those things towards the good, not just of God's plan, but actually for the good of God's people. That there is, some good that's coming out of something, but that it's not that there's nothing difficult. There's another passage I use a lot in pastoral counseling. Jesus said this. He said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome this world. Jesus guaranteed us trouble. But take heart, for I have overcome this world. There are some things that are true that I want you to put in your metaphorical pocket so that you can recall them when things that hit you are difficult. God does not cause your pain. God is with you in the pain. God did not want that painful thing to happen to you. God cries with you. God stands with you. God can strengthen you. God redeems suffering. God forces, now we can lean on this verse and we can say that God forces good to come from evil. Martin Luther King said that God bends evil into good. God bends evil into good. So that when you are 10 years down the road, you can see that there is good that came out of something hard. But that does not mean that God put that hard in your life to achieve that end. That just means that God's Spirit bent that evil to something good. Now, let's go back to my friend who was telling me about these difficult things. What if, when she had said to me, everything happens for a reason, right? What if I had said, I don't believe that quite that way? Would I have had an opportunity to remind her of the loving God that I believe in? The loving God who wants to continue to sit with her as she grieves these difficult things. In Adam Hamilton's book, Half-Truths, he tells a story about a family who lost their 3-year-old in a car accident. He wrote, as time went on, they became more active in their church, actually. And this is what the mom wrote to him in an email. At the time, I had had people telling me that it was Austin's time, and I was having a hard time believing in a God who would plan to take my child at 3. I learned that tragedies weren't necessarily part of God's plan, but that God gave us free will and that bad things sometimes happen. Understanding this helped me to turn to God instead of away from him. Since Austin's death, I believe that my faith has grown and continues to grow. His death changed the way I view God and my faith. I no longer have a naive, childlike faith where God protects you from all harm and makes everything okay. It's a deeper faith that has been tested through tragedy, and I know that God doesn't promise me a pain-free life, but he does promise to always be there to love me, comfort me, and guide me. My faith gives me something that people without faith don't have, hope. And I have hope for